What if I told you that all romantic notions of life in medieval castles are nothing but a beautiful lie? We see majestic stone walls, knights in shining armor, and noble ladies, but we never think about what these walls turned into when winter came. The truth is that these stone giants were not cozy fortresses, but icy traps where survival required a daily, exhausting struggle. It was a battle not against enemies, but against the air itself, which became cold and stagnant. Watch the video to the end to find out how people actually endured months of cold in stone bags, and what simple item of clothing was more important than a sword. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of medieval castles, which will forever change your perception of this era. The Great Hall was not just a place for feasts, as we are shown in movies. It was a collective center of survival, the only truly warm hub in this huge and cold structure. During the winter months, all social life in the castle, from administration to small crafts, was concentrated here, closer to the fire. It was here that destinies were decided, and it was here that the real battle for warmth took place. In the early Middle Ages, there was no fireplace in the center of this hall, but an open hearth. Imagine a large fire burning directly on the earthen or stone floor in the middle of a huge room. The smoke was supposed to escape through a special opening in the roof, but in practice, most of it remained inside. The air was heavy and acrid, and the walls and ceiling beams quickly became covered with a thick layer of soot. This was the constant price to pay for the precious warmth provided by the fire. The social hierarchy of the castle was particularly noticeable in the Great Hall during the winter. The lord's family sat at a high table on a special platform, or dais. This place was not only honorable, but also the warmest, as it was as far away from the main entrance as possible. The rest of the castle's inhabitants sat at long tables in the main part of the hall, and the lower their status, the closer they sat to the drafts. Simple but effective architectural solutions were used to combat the icy drafts that swept through the hall. A special wooden vestibule or screen passage was often built at the main entrance. This structure created a buffer zone that prevented cold air from rushing into the room every time the door was opened. It was a simple but vital improvement for retaining heat. The floor in the Great Hall presented a separate problem. It was either stone or earthen, and it was constantly cold. To insulate it in some way, the floor was sprinkled with straw or dry grasses such as reeds. This layer served as primitive insulation, but it had to be changed frequently to maintain relative cleanliness. Walking on such a floor was in any case warmer than on bare stone. When darkness fell, the Great Hall became not only a dining room, but also a communal bedroom. Many servants and lower-ranking people did not have their own rooms and spread their straw mattresses directly on the floor. They slept huddled together closer to the smoldering coals of the hearth. This was the only way to keep warm during the long, cold night. During the day, the hall was filled not only with smoke, but also with activity. Since it was too cold outside for many tasks, they were moved indoors. Women spun, wove, or mended clothes, while men repaired tools, cleaned equipment, or made simple household items. The hall buzzed with conversation and the clatter of tools, turning into a real beehive. It is important to understand that even with all these measures, the Great Hall was never warm in the modern sense. It was simply less cold than the rest of the castle or the street. The enormous volume of the room and the high ceilings made it impossible to heat it properly. People did not take off their outer clothing here, but only loosen their ties. The psychological significance of this place was enormous. The fire in the hearth was not just a source of heat, it was a symbol of life, safety, and community. As long as the fire burned, the castle lived. Being together in one space, even if it was smoky, brought people together and helped them survive the dark and cold months while waiting for spring. In the end, the Great Hall was not a luxurious banquet hall, but rather a crowded, smoky, and noisy station of survival. It was the heart of the castle, beating thanks to the fire and the people gathered around it. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about such a community center where life and work were inseparable? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about why castles were so cold and uncomfortable in terms of design? It's all about materials and priorities. Medieval castles were built primarily as fortresses, not as residential buildings. The main task was defense, and the comfort of the inhabitants was the last priority. The main building material was stone, which was ideal for protection against enemies. The problem with stone is that it has very high thermal conductivity. This means that it absorbs heat from inside the room incredibly quickly and releases it outside into the cold atmosphere. In winter, stone walls literally sucked all the heat out of the rooms. As a result, the inner surfaces of the walls were icy to the touch and covered with frost. The thickness of the walls, which in some castles reached 3 to 4 meters, was designed to withstand the impact of siege weapons. This thickness created what is known as thermal inertia. In summer, this was an advantage, as the massive walls heated up slowly, keeping the interior cool. But in winter, it became a curse. It took weeks to warm up this stone mass even slightly. The windows in castles were another source of enormous heat loss. In early fortresses, they were simply narrow loopholes, or arrow slits. They were ideal for defense, as they were difficult to hit from the outside, but they let in minimal light and maximum drafts. Through these narrow openings, the icy wind blew freely through the rooms. To protect against the wind, these window openings were covered with wooden shutters. The shutters blocked the draft, but along with it, the little daylight that could penetrate inside. As a result, the rooms were plunged into almost complete darkness. It was a constant compromise between keeping warm and being able to see anything at all. Glass was an incredible luxury in the Middle Ages. Only very wealthy lords or churches could afford glazed windows. Even then, it was not modern sheet glass, but small, uneven pieces held together with lead bridges. Such stained glass was beautiful, but still let in the cold and drafts. A cheaper alternative to glass was oiled parchment paper or thinly tanned leather. Sometimes even thin slices of horn were used. These materials let in a little dim light, allowing people to work in the room while providing relatively good protection from the wind. However, they were fragile and needed to be replaced constantly. The layout of the rooms inside the castle also played a role. The most important living quarters, such as the Lord's sunny room, were placed on the upper floors. This was done for two reasons. Firstly, warm air from the hearths and people on the lower floors rose upwards. And secondly, the upper floors were further away from the cold and damp ground. The internal layout of castles also did not contribute to heat conservation. The corridors we are accustomed to were often absent. Rooms were arranged in a row, meaning that passage from one room to another was through adjacent rooms. This led to constant air movement and drafts as each open door let out precious heat. As a result, the entire architecture of the castle was designed to withstand external enemies, but it left it completely defenseless against the main enemy of winter, the cold. Every detail, from stone floors to high ceilings, contributed to the rapid cooling of the rooms. Which of these architectural features do you think was the biggest problem for the inhabitants? In the next chapter, we will talk about the heart of the castle, fire, and how they tried to tame it.
It is much warmer than last winter.
What I am about to tell you literally changed the course of medieval architecture and everyday life. I am talking about an invention that finally allowed people to lift the fire off the floor and place it against the wall. This invention was the chimney. Before it existed, the only way to heat a room was with an open hearth in the center of the hall, with its constant smoke and soot. The first fireplaces attached to the wall were a real revolution. They allowed smoke to be directed outside through a pipe, rather than through a random hole in the roof. This meant that the air in the rooms became immeasurably cleaner. But more importantly, fireplaces could be built on different floors, which was impossible with a central hearth. This invention completely changed the layout of castles. Now it was possible to create smaller, more private and heated rooms. Private chambers, offices, and bedrooms with their own fireplaces appeared. The castle ceased to be a single dormitory around a single fire and began to be divided into functional areas. However, these early fireplaces had a huge problem. They were catastrophically inefficient. They were enormous, the size of a small alcove, and had a straight, wide chimney. This design created an incredibly strong draft that sucked not only smoke, but also almost all the heat out of the room. Most of the fire's energy literally flew out the chimney. This brings us to one of the main strategic problems of winter: fuel. The castle consumed wood on an industrial scale. It is estimated that hundreds of acres of forest were needed to heat an average castle during the winter. Supplying the castle with wood was as important a logistical task as supplying it with food. A special person was responsible for this task: the forester or forest keeper. He controlled the felling, transportation, and storage of firewood. Firewood was cut in the summer, dried, and stacked in huge wood piles in the castle's courtyards. This supply was strategic, and a shortage in winter could lead to disaster. If there was not enough firewood, alternative fuels were used. In some regions where there were few forests, peat was actively used. It was cut in swamps, dried, and used for heating. Peat produced less heat and more acrid smoke, but it was better than nothing. Dried dung was also used, which was common practice. To increase the efficiency of fireplaces, over time, a fireback, or rideros, was invented. This was a cast iron or stone plate that was placed against the back wall of the firebox. It heated up from the fire and began to radiate heat back into the room instead of it escaping into the wall. It was a simple but very important improvement. Despite all these tricks, the fire in the castle remained more of a symbol than a real source of comfort. It provided light, the ability to cook hot food, and one small spot of warmth around which all life was built. What if I told you that survival in an ice castle depended not on the thickness of the walls, but on the thickness of clothing? In the Middle Ages, people understood the main principle of thermal insulation perfectly well: multi-layering. No one tried to keep warm with a single heavy coat. Instead, they created a complex cocoon around the body from several layers of fabric, which effectively retained heat. It all started with an undershirt, or camise. It was made of linen, as linen absorbed moisture well and was pleasant to the body. This first layer was important from a hygiene point of view, as it protected more expensive outer clothing from sweat. In winter, these shirts could be quite thick, but they provided little warmth on their own. The real miracle of the medieval wardrobe was wool. Woolen fabric was the basis of everything. The main property of wool is that it continues to warm even when wet. In addition, its fibers create many air pockets, which are the main insulator. Wool was expensive, and good woolen clothing lasted for years. One or more woolen tunics were worn over a linen shirt. For winter, this was a long, knee or ankle-length garment with narrow sleeves. Another tunic, shorter and wider, made of denser fabric, could be worn over this one. This combination of layers created the very air gap that prevented body heat from escaping. The feet also required serious protection. Men wore chaussee, essentially separate stockings that were attached to the belt. In winter, they were also made of thick wool. Linen brie, or trousers, could be worn underneath. Women wore long woolen stockings that were tied below the knees. Various cloaks and capes served as outerwear. They were essential for moving through the drafty corridors of the castle. Cloaks were made of the thickest and heaviest woolen fabric, often with a lining. Such a cloak was not just clothing, but essentially a wearable blanket. The lining played a huge role. For wealthy people, cloaks and outer garments were lined with fur. This was not just for decoration. The fur created another thick insulating layer. The wealthier a person was, the more expensive the fur they could afford. Less wealthy people used sheepskin or cheaper fur as lining. At home in their rooms, people wore a kind of home-insulated clothing. These could be long, fur-lined robes or caftans. They were comfortable to sit by the fire in while going about one's business. No one walked around the castle in light clothing. It would have been tantamount to suicide. All this textile armor was heavy, bulky, and restricted movement. But it was the only personal heating system available. Which of these medieval clothing items do you find most practical? In the next chapter, we will learn how these people, dressed in 10 layers, tried to make the most personal and warmest place in the castle their bed. Winter nights in a medieval castle were the most severe test. When the sun went down and the fire in the fireplace burned out, the temperature in the rooms dropped rapidly, often falling to almost street level. Under these conditions, the only place where one could survive was in bed. But this was not just any bed, it was a complex engineering structure designed to retain heat. The epicenter of warmth in the private quarters was the sunroom, or solar. It was the private living room and bedroom of the lord and lady, usually located on the top floor, above the Great Hall. This location was strategic. The heat from the hall rose upwards, and having your own fireplace in the solar was a sign of high status and luxury. But even with a fireplace, the room remained cold. Therefore, the main piece of furniture in the center of life was a four-poster bed, or box bed. It was not just a piece of furniture, but a real room within a room. Tall wooden posts at the corners served as a frame on which heavy, thick curtains were hung. These curtains, or canopies, were a key element. They were sewn from the densest woolen fabric, velvet, or tapestry cloth. At night, they were tightly drawn on all four sides, creating a small enclosed space inside. The breath of the sleeping people quickly warmed this small volume of air. Inside this fortress was everything necessary to survive the night. The mattress itself was thick and multi-layered. The bottom layer, lying on a wooden lattice, was often made of straw. The top layer, the duvet, was a luxury. It was stuffed with goose down or feathers. It was soft and incredibly warm. The blankets were also heavy and multi-layered. Several quilted blankets were used and heavy fur covers were placed on top of them. The weight of such a cover could be quite significant, but it was necessary to keep every bit of precious heat in. A special stool was often needed to climb into such a high bed. But before going to bed, the bed had to be prepared. Servants brought special hot water bottles, metal or ceramic vessels with long handles. They filled them with hot coals from the fireplace and used them to iron the sheets, removing the icy dampness from them. A simpler version of a hot water bottle was a hot brick or stone wrapped in cloth, which was placed at the feet. This simple device helped to warm up and fall asleep. In some cases, special hand warmers were even used. Small metal balls with smoldering coals inside. Nightcaps were not a fun accessory, but a necessity. Since the head remained outside the heavy blankets, a lot of heat was lost through it. A thick woolen or felt cap, often with ties under the chin, helped to retain heat and protect against drafts, which could even be felt inside the bed canopy. It is important to note that privacy at that time was a relative concept. Often, personal servants slept in the same room, on the floor next to the Lord's bed. This was done both for security and to keep them close at hand. Their presence also added a little warmth to the shared space of the room.
Get those logs inside the keep. We need every sack of grain accounted for before nightfall.
Are you ready for the shocking truth about the medieval supermarket? It didn't exist. Winter was not just a cold season, it was a period of long and predictable siege by nature itself. The survival of the castle depended entirely on how well its inhabitants had prepared for it during the warm months. The entire autumn season was devoted to harvesting and preserving crops. The main method of preserving meat and fish was salting. Barrels of salted meat and fish were the basis of the winter diet. This product could be stored for months without spoiling and provided people with vital protein. Another popular method was smoking. Meat and fish were hung in special smokehouses where they were slowly treated with smoke. This not only gave them flavor, but also created a protective layer that prevented spoilage. Smoked hams and fish carcasses were a valuable reserve. Grain was the absolute king of winter supplies. It was carefully dried and stored in special barns or in the castle towers, where rodents could not reach it. Grain was used to bake bread, the main source of calories. It was also used to cook thick soups, or potages, and to make beer. Vegetables such as turnips, carrots, cabbage, and onions were stored in cool, dark cellars. They were placed in boxes with sand or simply hung from the ceiling. A properly equipped cellar could keep root vegetables fresh for several months, providing vitamins for the diet. Fruits such as apples and pears were also dried or stored in cellars. Berries and other fruits were used to make thick jams with honey as a preservative. These sweet preserves were not only a treat, but also an important source of quick energy on cold days. Dairy products were in short supply in winter, as cows produced little milk. Therefore, in summer, surplus milk was processed into products that could be stored for a long time, such as cheese and clarified butter. Wheels of hard cheese and barrels of butter were an important part of winter supplies. All this food was stored in strategically important places in the castle. Deep, cold cellars and storerooms were real treasure troves. Access to them was strictly controlled, and a special manager or keykeeper monitored the consumption of supplies. The process of cooking in winter was important not only for food, but also for warmth. The kitchen, which, due to the risk of fire, was often located in a separate building and was one of the warmest places in the castle. Huge hearths where food was cooked burned around the clock. In winter, the emphasis was on hot, fatty, and filling food. Thick soups with meat and root vegetables, porridge, hot bread. All this helped the body get the calories it needed to fight the cold. Hot food was not just a pleasure, but a tool for survival. Which of these methods of preserving supplies do you think is the most reliable and ingenious? But food was not the only thing that saved people from the cold and damp. In the next chapter, we will talk about real fur coats for stone walls, which cost a fortune. When we look at medieval tapestries in museums, we admire the intricate hunting scenes or biblical stories. But for people in the Middle Ages, these huge canvases were not so much art as a vital insulation technology. Hanging tapestries on the walls was like putting a warm fur coat on a stone castle. As we already know, bare stone walls were the main source of cold. Not only did they draw heat out of the room, but they were also often damp due to condensation. Living in such a room was not only unpleasant, but also simply dangerous to health. Tapestries were designed to solve this problem. The secret of their effectiveness was not in the fabric itself, but in the air gap. Tapestries were never hung close to the wall. They were attached to special wooden slats or hooks at a certain distance from the stone. This gap, filled with still air, was the insulator. This layer of air interrupted the heat exchange between the warm room and the cold wall. In addition, the fabric blocked the icy drafts that could seep through the cracks in the masonry. A room hung with tapestries immediately became much warmer and drier. Pure wool was almost always used as the material for tapestries. Wool threads were strong, held dye well, and most importantly, had excellent thermal insulation properties. Sometimes silk threads were added to the wool to give shine to certain details, but the base was always wool. Creating a single tapestry was an incredibly long and laborious process. A team of weavers could work on a large canvas for several years. This made tapestries astronomically expensive. Only the wealthiest aristocrats or the church could afford such wall insulation. The cost of tapestries was comparable to that of a warship or an entire estate. They were a symbol not only of taste, but also of enormous wealth and status. The more tapestries there were in a castle, the more powerful its owner was considered to be. Due to their enormous value, tapestries were mobile property. When a lord moved from one castle to another, he took his tapestries with him. They were carefully removed from the walls, rolled up, and transported in a wagon. Upon arrival at the new location, they were immediately hung up, turning cold walls into relatively cozy living quarters. Another option was so-called painted fabrics. These were linen or hemp canvases on which expensive tapestry patterns were imitated with paint. They were much cheaper to produce and also helped to combat drafts, although they were inferior to heavy wool in terms of thermal insulation. Winter in the Middle Ages meant not only cold, but also almost complete darkness. Daylight hours were short, and artificial lighting was expensive, inefficient, and dangerous. Long winter evenings, lasting 16 or 17 hours, were a real test for the psyche and daily life of the castle's inhabitants. The main and most accessible source of light for most people was the fire in the hearth or fireplace. It gave off a lively but uneven and dim light. People tried to do all their work while it was still light, and when dusk fell, they gathered closer to the fire. Its flames allowed them to make out silhouettes and perform simple tasks. For more focused lighting, they used splinters, thin pieces of dry wood. They gave off a bright but very short flame and smoked heavily. The splinters had to be constantly replaced, which required someone's constant attention. It was the cheapest, but also the most labor-intensive form of lighting. A more advanced option was bowl lamps. These were simple clay or metal bowls filled with animal fat or vegetable oil. A wick made of moss or twisted fabric was dipped into the fat. Such lamps burned longer than splinters, but emitted a terrible smell and smoked even more. The most common type of personal lighting was tallow candles. They were made from beef or mutton fat, lard. The manufacturing process was simple. The wick was repeatedly dipped into melted fat until it reached the desired thickness. Such candles were relatively cheap, but they had many drawbacks. Tallow candles burned unevenly, melted, and their wicks had to be constantly trimmed with special tongs. They gave off a dim, yellowish light and spread a disgusting smell of burnt fat. In addition, they smoked heavily, covering the walls and ceilings with a layer of greasy soot. The real luxury, available only to churches and the wealthiest homes, were beeswax candles. Wax candles burned brightly, evenly, produced almost no smoke, and gave off a pleasant honey aroma. The cost of such candles was enormous, and their consumption was strictly controlled. Torches could be used to light large spaces, such as the Great Hall during a feast. These were sticks with tow wrapped around the end, soaked in resin or wax. However, they were not used in living quarters because of the unbearable amount of smoke and open fire, which created a huge fire hazard. Due to the expense and danger of lighting, many people in the castle simply went to bed when darkness fell. Going to bed early was not a sign of laziness, but a sensible way to save fuel for lamps and candles. Winter nights were a time of long, but often interrupted sleep in a cold bed. We have talked a lot about lords and ladies, their fireplaces, four-poster beds, and rich chambers with carpeted floors and tapestry-covered walls. But the vast majority of the castle's inhabitants were not nobles at all, but servants, soldiers, craftsmen, and workers without whom the castle simply could not exist. They were the living body of the castle, working from dawn to dusk in the cold, damp, and soot. They had no access to private rooms, fur blankets, or wax candles. Their survival depended on two simple but unbreakable factors: constant work and collectivism. Without movement, without work, and without the warmth of human bodies, they simply would not have survived the long winter within the stone walls. For many servants, the warmest place in the castle was the kitchen. It was not just a room for cooking food, it was the real center of life and warmth. Huge hearths on which meat was roasted, soups were cooked, and water was boiled, burned almost around the clock. The flames did not go out even at night when bread was baked or the heat was maintained for the morning meal. This room was unbearably hot, filled with thick smoke and the smell of soot mixed with the aroma of fat and burnt food. But at least it wasn't cold there. For the cooks and their assistants, the kitchen became a kind of bathhouse where they could warm up a little, even at the cost of suffocating heat and constant soot on their faces. The kitchen played a much greater role than just cooking. It was the technical heart of the castle, providing heat to the entire building. It was here that bricks and stones were heated, which were then carried to the lord's chambers, wrapped in cloth and placed under the blanket to warm the bed before bedtime. It was also here that water was boiled for the nobility to bathe, and in winter for washing dishes and laundry, which was a feat in itself in the cold conditions. The kitchen provided the castle with heat, food, and even light. Its hearth was a symbol of life within the cold stone walls. Other relatively warm places were the workshops, where work continued even in winter. In the smithy, where the forge was constantly burning, the heat was almost unbearable. The metal was heated until it was white hot, sparks rained down, and the blacksmith and his apprentices worked without rest. The smithy was a veritable tropical island in the middle of an icy castle. But along with the warmth came the hardship of labor, the constant noise of hammers, the clanging of metal, sweat, soot, and fatigue. Even here, where it was possible to warm up, people's bodies were often covered with burns and abrasions, and their breath absorbed smoke and fumes. Nevertheless, the forge was one of the few rooms where one could feel alive in winter. The soldiers of the garrison lived in much harsher conditions. Their barracks were usually located on the lower floors of the towers, where the air was cold and the walls were damp. Drafts blew through the narrow loopholes, and even the thick stone walls did not protect them from the winter cold. The soldiers slept on rough wooden bunks covered with straw, covering themselves with their cloaks. Their only source of heat was a small fireplace or brazier, which they took turns stoking to keep the fire from going out. At night, sentries stood guard by the fire, replacing each other every few hours because, if the brazier stopped, the cold penetrated to the bone. Most of the lower-ranking servants did not have their own rooms at all. They were not entitled to personal space or beds. As already mentioned, they slept right on the floor of the Great Hall, on straw mattresses, which were laid out closer to the hearth in the evening, when the nobility left the hall. There, near the dying fire, they lay down in a heap, huddling together to retain what little warmth remained. It was the only way to keep from freezing at night. In the morning, before dawn, they got up to remove the traces of their overnight stay. No one was to see that the servants had slept in the hall where knights and guests gathered during the day. Their clothes were simple and coarse, homespun wool, thick and prickly. No lining, no fur, no silk shirts. Often the same clothes served as both day and night wear. They ate, worked, and slept in them. They were rarely changed because each item was expensive and hand-sewn. They had to generate heat by moving, carrying water from the well, running up and down the stairs, chopping wood. As long as the body moved, it lived. As soon as you stopped, the cold penetrated inside, numbing your fingers and making your teeth chatter. Work was not just a duty, but a way to survive. The entire life support system of the castle depended on these people. They were its blood and breath. As long as the servant ran through the corridors with a bucket of water, as long as the blacksmith struck with his hammer, as long as the cook kneaded dough, the castle lived. As soon as they stopped, life within the walls froze, and the cold prevailed once again. The diet of the castle's commoners was modest but nutritious. They ate thick porridge made from barley and oats, bread made from coarse flour, vegetable stews, and beer soup. Sometimes on rare holidays, they got leftovers from the Lord's table, a piece of roasted meat or a little cheese. A hot bowl of soup in winter was no less valuable to them than a dish with spices, and wine was to their masters. Food warmed them from the inside, restored their strength, and reminded them that life goes on. Thus, the lower class in the castle survived not because of luxury, but because of their place in the overall mechanism. They were built into the metabolism of the castle. It breathed and lived only thanks to their efforts. Their warmth was not in comfort, but in movement. Their strength was in labor and mutual support. Their night was one of cramped quarters, the breath of those sleeping nearby, the smell of smoke and wet wool. It was they, nameless and invisible, who warmed the stone walls with their constant movement, their hands, their sweat, and their breath. The castle was sustained by their lives, by this living human fire. We can see that life in a medieval castle in winter was far from a fairy tale. It was a harsh ordeal that required incredible preparation, ingenuity, and endurance. Every element of daily life, from architecture to clothing and food, was subordinated to the main task, fighting the cold. It was a multi-layered defense system. Stone walls, tapestries, layered clothing, canopy beds, all were part of a unified strategy to preserve precious heat. Fire was the center of this universe, but it was inefficient and required enormous resources. Survival in the castle was a collective effort. From the lord planning supplies to the last servant carrying firewood, everyone contributed to ensuring that this stone giant could survive another winter. What other aspects of medieval life would you like us to explore in future episodes? Perhaps you are interested in hygiene, medicine, or the justice system of that era. Suggest your topics in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new dives into real history.